at the end of tonight, I just want you to have three principles firmly established in your mind, and they're not that complicated. I have three things that I want to identify here, and one of them is terrain terrors. The other is point precipitation perdition, I call it, and the third one is density delusions. These are three important characters. First issue regarding terrain terrors is all about the fact that the model terrain does not match the real terrain. The impacts or the effects are upon temperature, wind, precipitation type, and the precipitation amount. The second issue is around mapping to the nearest grid point. So this is kind of a conceptual, meteorological and mathematical model you need to have in your head when you're using this to understand the pitfalls of spot weather, which, by the way, is a fantastic site. I've been in more or less constant contact over the years since Garth out in Manitoba created this. And he's on our side in this whole thing, I can tell you that. He's also just recently made some changes that have made my life a lot easier. Basically, I asked him about a couple things, and he said he was updating spot weather soon in a couple of months. And I said, okay, Garth, don't worry about it. Just do it in a couple of months. And sure enough, he called me the next day or texted me the next day, said, yeah, I made that one change already, and I'll probably have the other one done by tomorrow. So that's the kind of guy Garth is. So I'm encouraging everyone to support him on the Spot Weather website. There is a donate button, and get on it if you can, because this is valuable stuff. So the second point is point precipitation perdition. And the issue is mapping to the nearest grid point. And this affects snowfall and precipitation amount, or can affect snowfall and precipitation amount. The third one is the simple issue that I've been speaking a lot about on my daily broadcasts of the Whistler weather and the powder picker, and that's assumptions about snow density. So a lot of folks starting to get this. And my goal really in this presentation and through the Whistler powder picker is to get you guys thinking like and talking like meteorologists. So we're all on the same page here, and we can all understand exactly what we're talking about. And frankly, once you understand the concepts, it's a lot easier to transmit information and receive information when we're using the same, I don't want to call it jargon because jargon's a problem, but there is a few buzzwords that you need to know here. And in this case, the third issue is that assumption about snow density. And that's why I'm constantly talking about snowfall density like a proper meteorologist. Two things to note before we jump into this. This is an image showing basically in simple figures this idea of snow to liquid water ratio, or the slur as I referred to in my broadcast today. And the diagram shows it. 10 units of snow basically melts to 1 unit of water in the perfect world. And at Whistler, we're really convenient on the coast here because this works tremendously well virtually all of the time. Mark Barton, one of my former colleagues at Environment Canada, did an enormous study of 27 years of what we call pristine high elevation weather data, which avalanche forecasters and Whistler staff have been responsible for. And Environment Canada, we were, when I was at Environment Canada, super grateful for that information because it's quality, it's top quality information. And that should dispel any notions that anyone has that anybody on the mountain regarding weather is trying to fool you in any way, shape, or form about how much snow or what the temperature is or what the wind is. The first thing you need to know is that when it comes to forecasts of snow, usually these forecasts are just a model forecast of liquid precipitation that's been converted to snow using a snow to liquid ratio, or slur, of 10 to 1. So that's usually what you get. Now, as the models are getting more sophisticated, we're starting to see these efforts to change the slur either seasonally, that's the crudest way to do it, or possibly on the basis of the air temperature and some other variables that are really important to snow density. So that's the future. It's coming. But right now, most of the stuff you see is simply output of the liquid water multiplied by 10 to get the snowfall in centimeters. The second thing you need to know is that models, like cameras, have different resolutions. Here's an example of a typical high resolution grid. You can see it doesn't even cover all of British Columbia here. And the reason it doesn't is because the data points are so close together. We're limited by computer power here. When we move to the next kind of rough scale, it's a regional scale. We've got a bigger map. We're dealing with all of Canada. Now you've got a bigger map, and so you've got to space the grid points or the data points out. Otherwise, your model is going to run super slow on the supercomputer. And on top of that, on the right-hand side, this gives you an idea of a global scale model, or at least a semi-global scale model. We don't really care what's going on in the southern half of the atmosphere in the southern hemisphere because it's really disconnected at the equator. So this is roughly what we're talking about, 3 different scales. And the larger the area covered by any model, the lower the resolution. So on the right, the global is the most coarse resolution. Okay, I'll get to more of that in a second, but this is typically or operationally right now is 15 kilometers. So at that model on the right, the global scale, you've got one data point in the grid every 15 kilometers. That's for the atmosphere and for the terrain, because the Earth is in this model as well, because weather obviously is seriously impacted by the terrain, in fact, entirely driven by it. So the model atmosphere on the right has one data point every 15K, and the terrain has one data point every 15K. They have to match. In the middle, we're looking at the regional scale. The separation between model points is 10K. On the left-hand side, we're looking at a high-resolution operational model grid, and that right now with Environment Canada is about 2.5K. So much tighter, way more data wrapped up, and so for that reason, we've got lower coverage, aerially speaking. And that has implications for stepping out in time, because obviously with more data, you can only go out so far in time. And so small grids like this that are intensely populated with data points, these models typically only run 18 to 24 hours into the future. Whereas the global scale model on the far right runs out 120 or 240 hours operationally. So your long-range forecasts that you see at Environment Canada, they're all coming off of automated processes fed by the global model, and maybe at times an ensemble, but doesn't matter. Let's call it the global model, okay? So the smaller the area, the shorter the forecast. And there it is, high-res models step out in the short term 2 days, and those global models go out 5 to 10 days. So model grids, they're actually 3-dimensional grids, but we look at them in 2D quite a bit. And basically, this is showing, as you can see by the text on the bottom there, a 10 by 10. So this would be the regional scale model grid. And in the vertical, so from the ground of the model up to the top of the atmosphere, there are multiple levels. This doesn't matter too much to all of us right now, but let me say there's just 50 odd of them probably in most of the models right now. And this is really just the same representation that you see in any kind of contoured attempt to model terrain as per the picture on the right-hand side here, or like a contour map that you use when you're hiking in the backcountry. So the atmosphere and the terrain are 3-dimensional, obviously. So a model grid is just a 2-dimensional representation of the 3D cells into which the models divide the atmosphere and the terrain. Okay, this is a look at the real terrain. If you're really sharp, you're recognizing Whistler somehow in here. I managed to keep any points of reference, but the big W in the blue triangle, that's Whistler, and this is off some super high scale map showing the contours at probably every 100 feet or something like that, or 30 meters, I don't know. In any case, this is what the terrain looks like on the high-resolution model that's operational for Environment Canada. I've highlighted in green here around Whistler where the model terrain is actually above 2,000 meters. And it's only in select locations, as you can see. And when we go to the next scale of model, the regional size, I've highlighted the terrain in the model around Whistler or due south of it. That's Cheakamus Lake right there below the W, by the way. 1,500 meters, I've highlighted in yellow and black. When you're looking at the regional scale model around Whistler, if you get to 1,600 meters, if you can drop a pin or a point on that spot weather map that shows up as 1,500 meters plus, you're touching about the highest terrain as the model sees it around Whistler. The global looks like this. This was actually from the 25K when the global was 25. It's now 15. So for all intents and purposes, the global model tops out at somewhere above 1,300 meter. Anytime you drop a pin on the spot weather map, you look at it, at best, with the global scale model stepping out your 10 days, you're looking at something that probably doesn't even closely match the elevation of the point that you're interested in, okay? The implications of this are as follows. I've got the real elevation of a point on the left-hand side, and working across the top, this is just the meteorological jargon or acronyms, which we're famous for all the models. So starting with the HRDPS, that's high res, the regional DPS, which just stands for Deterministic Prediction System, and then the global. So it's high res, regional, global, left across. And Blackcomb Peak is actually at 2,436 meters, strictly speaking, as measured. The highest resolution model that we have is the HRDPS, and it has Blackcomb Peak sitting at 1,850 meters. If you manage to drop a pin on a model point or a point somewhere around Whistler and you come back on the HRDPS when you interrogate that interface and it comes back with 1849, congratulations. There are maybe a few higher spots on this, but this one's close to what I use operationally. All right. On the regional, Blackcomb Peak sits at 1,419 meters. So that's fully 1,000 meters below where it actually is in real life. And the global, as you can imagine, is even lower at 1,356 meters. That's the peaks. When you're looking at modeling of the atmosphere and the terrain, we squish the peaks down. On the other hand, when you're in complicated terrain like the mountains of BC anywhere, the opposite impact occurs in the valley bottoms. So we raise the valley bottoms up, and that's no more apparent than at Squamish Airport, which sits at 52 meters inland north of the city or the town of Squamish. And the highest resolution model has that airport sitting at 265 meters. You know, that's a good 600 feet difference in elevation. So lots of times the rain snow condition when the temperature's hovering around zero, that's why it's tricky. So the regional has the Squamish Airport at 763 meters. When you stick the pin in the spot weather map and then you go to the regional model to interrogate it, what you're seeing when you look at the temperature there is the temperature at 763 meters, not down in the valley. And likewise, the global, as you can imagine, pumps it even higher at 878 meters. So we've got this squishing and this raising of the peaks first and then the valleys that makes things complicated. Keep that in mind. That's key point number one, and we'll take questions at the end because this is a bit hard to manage, I know. As I said, it took me a while to get this as a functional operating meteorologist. Point precipitation perdition is something that arises as a function of looking at grids, which is all the model is, and then attaching your spot to the nearest model grid. There's some consequences of that. So when you click on the spot weather map, you drop your pin, and then you go to interrogate any one of the models that's listed there. What the model does is connect you to the nearest model grid point. So you're not even actually where you think you are, strictly speaking, when you drop that pin, because it's unlikely that you've dropped yourself right on the model grid point. And spot weather is just going to say, okay, anything in this area is going to get mapped over there. I want you to consider how reliable a point forecast for precipitation is given the following scenarios. I'm going to drop some precipitation in green on here and show you the amounts in black text. So here we go. Consider these outcomes of a model forecast. Oh, sorry. We're going to just say this is the high-res grid spacing of 2.5, so the model points are 2.5K apart. All right. So here's a model solution, the forecast for some 12-hour, 10-hour, 3-hour time period where this rainfall, the precipitation, the liquid water showed up like this pattern shows. So Whistler properly speaking, is right within the rain band, but the model point that it's mapped to has just zipped you out of there. So when you click on that Whistler, you're remapped to that model point that says dry as a bone. But very close to you, there's some rain happening, or there was some rain. Likewise for this. So the pattern of precipitation can be all around your particular point that you've been driven to, and you might be misled, okay? Here's a really extreme example, but imagine there's a gradient in the precipitation from 10 all the way up to 40, and the track of the storm ends up depositing the precip in this particular pattern. You drop your pin and go, oh yeah, I'm going away. It's not going to rain. It's not going to snow. But because of some freak of nature, the storm has delivered a super great, super strong gradient in the precip right next to Whistler. And Whistler's in it under that blue triangle, but your model point is not. This is why you need a spatial representation of the precip in addition to the spot representation or the spot forecast. And, I could go even further into the details. Think about the complication of the terrain not matching the real terrain. The real terrain drives what actually happens. Not only that, you've got this further complication of the terrain not really matching, and that's going to impact the precipitation in a huge way. So it's complicated. But all you need to know is that what you want to do is have a spatial representation in addition to your point forecast, and you're good. And I'll demonstrate that here in a second. And by the way, Garth has long had plans for Spot Weather to spit out a map to give you just this spatial representation, because it's critical. Otherwise, you can get seriously burned, especially if you're a fire weather forecaster. You want to know where the rain is likely to get or what the risk is that it won't get there. Here's a good example of how I use the spatial representation. And one of the reasons I've tried to cut out single integer numbers in the powder picker is because they're misleading. And you see this on television weather all the time. People are setting up graphics that are spitting out precise numbers for precipitation. Rain is never that precise. And snow, for sure as shit, is not precise at all. If you look at the Cascades forecast for the Americans down in the US, it's not uncommon to see them forecast 3 to 6 feet of snow. There's a reason for that, because snow varies like crazy. So just be skeptical when anyone presents you with precipitation information that's down to a single integer. It's implying precision that's just not there. So that's a challenge. Here's the point forecast for Latin Peak, which is just north of Bella Coola. And this was at some warm time of the year. The blue line and the blue all represents rainfall in 3-hour chunks. The line is the accumulated. So roughly speaking, what we're looking at here is this little period of several hours of rain results in about 6 millimeters of precipitation for Latin Peak. Now, let's consider it wintertime, and we've got a forecast of 6 millimeters of precipitation. Here's the spatial representation of that same forecast. Now, this was actually in June, but let's just imagine this is the winter. You can have really cold Junes too. This happens all the time. Latin Peak is right in there, just north of Bella Coola. And if you squint, you can see that it's roughly into, 2 or 3 shades of green. It's away from the dark green. And there's some yellow, the infamous yellow that I refer to all the time on the maps, is north of Latin Peak and also towards Bella Coola, just under the L's, there's some yellow. If this was winter and this pattern emerged, which is quite possible, as a forecaster, I'd be looking at this, and a reasonable forecast just based on 10 to 1, and the pattern we're looking at here, this is saying nothing about the snow density. A reasonable forecast for that area would be very American in this sense, 5 to 25 centimeters. We don't know the model's going to handle the storm perfectly, so some of that yellow may bleed over into Latin Peak. We don't know that. So you don't have you look at this map with a bit of a healthy skepticism and say, okay, I'm not going to rely on that point forecast. I'm going to look at the spatial representation and say, wow, if the model's wrong, the storm moves faster or moves further south, you know what? Maybe we get up to 25. At least if you're out on a trip and you're traversing different terrain and you're up and down the peaks, this is what the potential is, 5 to 25. Consider that versus a forecast of 6. That's where the misleading part comes in, or can be misleading. Okay, the last one, the third point, is density delusions. And I've covered this a lot, and you know what? It's pretty straightforward when you think 10 to 1, 10 to 1 all the time. Given a liquid water forecast of 10 millimeters, the following snowfall amounts are possible under different SLRs, SLRs, snow to liquid water ratios. At 10 to 1, 10 millimeters will give you 10 centimeters. But in Arctic air, at 30 to 1, you get 30 centimeters of absolute fluff. And this gets real interesting when you look at a forecast of 30 millimeters of liquid water. The corresponding amounts turn into almost a meter. This is why snowfall is so aggravatingly variable, because the density is constantly varying over the terrain, with elevation, as it's subject to cold outflows, as it's subject to warm inflows of air off the water. And so you get these spectacular variations in snowfall simply as a consequence of these density delusions. Be prepared to go above the liquid water forecast and below it. And that's what I try to hint at in the powder picker. We're now sticking to strictly liquid water equivalent forecasts in the powder picker, but I'm going to hint at 20 to 1 versus the usual 10 to 1. And by the way, in Mark Barton's study, all time of all those observations in the winter taken at Whistler, the average is 11 to 1, but the variability at Whistler ranges from 3 to 1 to 40 to 1. Now, when you're at 40 to 1, I'm not even sure you can ski that, because you're probably just going right through it and feeling the crust on the bottom of it, no matter how deep it is. 40 to 1 is probably actually not fun to ski. It's a rare event, believe me. But, 10 to 1's the usual here. So those small amounts can turn into magic. And that's why I'm always hinting, do what I do. Look at the forecast, say, okay, great. I'm going to watch the snow stake, and I'm going to look at it in the morning and see how this turned out. Summary, here it is, 3 quick points. Note the elevation difference between your point and the model representation of your point. And here's where it is when you click on, say, the GFS forecast. It's right under the title. This is the first thing your eye needs to be drawn to. That right there. Every time you click up a new model. Boom, boom, boom. And if you scan these, the bottom's cut off, but you can see every model, because of its different resolution, and even when the terrain, or even when the resolution rather, is the same, sometimes the model terrain could be different. So this is the first thing you want to know. I think we've got that. Number 2, use a spatial representation in conjunction with a point forecast. That's it. Number 3, remember that huge variations in snowfall result from errors in estimating snow density, among other things. I could speak for 2 hours over the problems and the challenges of forecasting snowfall in the lower mainland, which no one in the lower mainland actually understands. But you need to understand this to make your decisions and understand what the forecasters are struggling with, not so you can have empathy with us or sympathy with us, so that you can make a better decision and understand the variability that's possible.